Children begin by loving their parents. As they grow older, they judge them. Sometimes they forgive them. Oscar Wilde.
Bending Not Breaking, the Dragon Prince Edition. Season 3, Episode 8, Dragonguard. Welcome back to another episode of Bending Not Breaking. This is Ben Pruitt, your host for this mini-series while we are in between seasons of Legend of Korra, which we are on episode 8 of a 9-episode season, which you know what that means. That means it is likely that we will be coming back to Korra very shortly, and I'm very excited about that. So I hope that everybody listening to all these Dragon Prince episodes will join us for that as well. But today we have a really fun guest. I'm excited to introduce one of our patrons. Rahul is joining us today. Rahul, how are you today?
I'm doing okay. How about you, Ben?
I'm all right. I'm taking part of this pilot program, and I just got out of a meeting, and it's working out. I'm enjoying it so far. So it's piloting well. I can't really say more than that, but it's neat.
Awesome.
Okay. My co-host has recently been diagnosed with COVID. And so, yeah, Sunshine, for those of you who know Sunshine, had COVID this past week. He is out of quarantine now, thankfully. But that has kind of meant, since we are kind of living in the same house, that means that we have been having to wear masks and do a lot of stuff away from each other. But we've been surviving and we've made it work, and I have successfully avoided it so far. So that has been nice. But that's kind of what I've been kind of grappling with this past week. But what's kind of on your radar? What's good in the world of Rahul today?
This past week I graduated from my master's program at Pitt.
Woo!
Mechanical engineering. So finishing up my internship, then next month I'll be starting a new job somewhere in there. I have to move to a new apartment. Moving is always so much fun.
It's the worst.
No, it's the worst. But yeah, that's kind of like the broad update. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's a huge transition. How are you feeling about it? Are you excited? Are you nervous? Are you terrified? Are you all of the above? What's the deal?
To be honest, I think I haven't really had time to process, because especially with graduation, there's just been a series of tasks that I've just had to focus on in order to make sure that I can graduate.
Welcome to post-graduation.
yeah. So I just need to create some distance where I can finally say, oh, this actually happened and is official. And that may not actually happen until I get my diploma. So I don't know. Otherwise, I'm not going to believe that this actually happened.
Yeah. Yeehaw, man. Well, I am just grateful that you are about to go off into the world and do things and make the world a little bit better, hopefully, in your work. So congrats on graduating. That's big.
Thank you so much.
So I was asking patrons if they wanted to join for this season, and you said yes. And then you said this episode. I'm curious, why this episode? What about this episode attracted you to it?
Well, when I was watching the show, I've only gone through the show once, and all of season 3 I thought was incredible. But this episode in particular, there's something about those episodes of shows where it's sort of the calm before the storm, not necessarily the climax, but what precedes the climax. So, in Avatar, you have the episodes before the Day of Black Sun. You have the episodes leading up to the finale, which have always really stood out to me as being incredible moments to explore the characters and especially how far they've come up until this point,
Yeah.
and really reflect on their journeys.
Hmm.
And I thought this episode was really great to
Yeah.
explore.
I think what you see a little bit is how it seems like you really get a chance to dive into the what's going on in their head, right? And so we see
Exactly.
in this episode, we see a lot of dialogue and interaction between Callum and Rayla, and we see what has got them to this point, and we kind of see the story that they've been telling themselves for so long. And yeah, I hear you. There's a lot that goes down in the quote calm before the storm. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. And then you also got to choose the lens for the episode. So you chose lineage for the
Correct.
lens. And I'm curious, what is it and why did you choose it?
So I think, throughout the show and what we see in this episode is that one of the core elements that kind of ties a lot of the main characters together is their relationships, specifically within their own family and with their parental figures. So, in this episode, you have Rayla exploring how she kind of perceives her parents and how they have fulfilled their duty, or how she thinks that they abandoned their duty. You have Callum, who, over the course of the show, a lot of the focus is on exploring his relationship with Harrow. But another sort of element to Callum's character that he's been exploring is his capabilities as a mage, which are currently and always doubted by others because he's a human and not an elf. You also have Ezrin, where I think it's especially interesting this season when you learn that Harrow, even though, we see him in this very altruistic light, he has made decisions that have impacted his legacy and have, taken the world in a particular direction that Ezrin kind of has to, come to terms with Harrow's legacy not necessarily being as, idealized as he may have previously thought, and trying to move forward from the decisions his father made and take the world in a new direction. And then I think one of my favorite moments in this episode, and I'm kind of going through a lot of the moments on like a broad level now, so I'm sorry about that, Brendan Viren. And I'll leave exploration of that for later on. But I think Soren's character is incredibly fascinating for me, especially this season and this episode.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me hearing you kind of reflect on all of these different I'm going to use the word ties for lack of a better word, like what ties us to other people. And their lineage to me feels like a very blood oriented word, in the sense that how are we related through the lineage of one thing in our past, right? And how are we all related to that one thing? And so the kind of the way my schooling has kind of taught me recently, coming out of divinity school, has been like thinking about lineage from a Christian perspective in terms of like, oh, everyone has lineage back to Adam and Eve, right? And thinking about what does it do? And I don't necessarily subscribe to that at all, but like, what does it do when we are all connected to something the further back we go? And what if from this evolutionary standpoint, even, we all are evolving from one organism that split off in multiple different ways and mutated in various different ways over the course of a very long history. And yeah, we're kind of related to dragons, and yeah, all these different types of elves are related. And yeah, there's a lot of questions around what does it do when we see ourselves as connected to other people, and what does it do when we don't. And I think that's
Right.
the question I'm going into this episode with. But before we discuss this any further, I have the pleasure of inviting you to lead us in a 30-second recap of the episode. It's the great joy of having patrons on, as I get to subject you to the feeling of a 30-second recap. How are you feeling about it?
I'm pretty nervous. I have a couple notes, but like, yeah, I don't really know if this is gonna work or not.
Yeah, I'm excited about everybody's approach. Some people have like full notes, and some people had no notes, and some people have some. So let's just see how it turns out. All right. Here we go. On your mark, get set, go.
The Dragon Queen won't wake up. Zim is scared. Rael is guilty. Her parents abandoned the queen. Soren is saved by Ezra and Callum, and he warns that Viren is on his way. Callum wants to learn how Ibis, the Skywing Elf, can grow wings, but Ibis just has to run away. Callum and Raela fight over her refusal to leave. He shows her the truth about her parents. They guarded the dragons from Viren. The group has to decide what to do. Cue Should I Stay or Should I Go by The Clash. Soren affirms that Viren must be stopped. Group decides to wait for the final battle.
Wow, look at that. Nice job. That was with like 1.4 seconds left. That was really nice.
Okay.
Yeah. It's nerve-wracking, right? This is why I make Sunshine do it every time. If only. Well, cool. All right. So now that we are all fully reinvigorated with the knowledge that we need to take part in this episode, I want to just kind of I'm going to toss it to you and give you the softball of what is a moment that you want to discuss regarding lineage in this episode.
Yeah, I think the most apparent one, and the namesake of the episode, is probably talking about the Dragonguard and Rayla's parents.
Yeah.
And her journey through the show and through this episode of kind of coming to terms with how she feels about their role in all of this, and what happened when Viren attacked the Dragon Queen and the egg.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing, because I struggle with this, and I'm going to specifically point to the moment where like Rayla feels tied to the fate of her parents and the judgment of her community of her parents, right? And so because she is sharing, like she is their daughter, right? Because she is a part of them in some way, she feels responsible for their actions and the judgments of the Moonshadow Elves. And like, it's really interesting to me because Rayla has done nothing wrong, right? She has, especially when it comes to the Dragonguard, right? She has done so many things right, and she has been constantly like living by these values. And then she gets to this point where she feels like she has to stay and like die. That was like, she's willing to die because that's the better option, is to die in vain than it is to flee and potentially live and survive another day. And that's before she has all the information that she's going to learn soon. But It's one of those things where like that to me is like, that doesn't seem like a logical decision. So I'm curious what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was kind of thinking about watching this time is I don't know how much of Rayla's perception of the guilt she carries around her parents is something that she's discovered about herself, or something that is been bestowed upon her by others, because we see in, I think it's episode 3, when she goes back to her home, she's ostracized. And it definitely speaks to there's we don't know what the response was to what happened with Rayla's parents in her hometown. And there is a decent chance that her parents' perceived failure reflected very poorly on Rayla, and she may have gotten a lot of flack. And it seems that, when we see her in the beginning of the show, she's kind of on rocky ground with the other Moonshadow elves.
Yeah.
Maybe because of this. And, obviously we don't really know for sure, but I'm very interested to know how much of Rayla's insecurity around what happened with her parents is sort of come from herself or come from others.
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking about here is if you are going through your life with the constant desire and need to prove yourself because of your parents' inability to follow a certain direction or do something a certain way, you are going to be constantly making decisions in order to make up for that. And so you're living in a scarcity mindset from the very beginning of, I'm not enough, I have to prove myself, I have to be better than. And what that does to a person is not great. Like when people are living in this need to prove, oftentimes that leads to acting outside of values. But it's interesting because what we see Rayla do in season 1 is that she chooses her values over the, having to prove herself. So it either highlights the bravery and the courage that it took to step out of that bond that she made, knowing what it would be like, or it points to maybe she thought that would be a redeeming thing that she did once they knew why she made that decision.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the bond is a really good point, because it's a constant reminder of almost this, quote, unfulfilled duty. And it's duty in the most kind of objective sense, I guess, where it's duty that is, given to her that she doesn't necessarily believe in, especially after she proceeds on this journey with Callum and Ezrin. But this is this reminder of where she came from, and the duty that the Moonshadow elves are trying to uphold.
Well, and it's just, I think because the goal of this exercise, this whole podcast goal, is not to be like just full on critical, but also like, why is this the way things are, and what can we learn about people when this is the way things are? And what it's kind of showing me is that we hold people responsible for their lineage, for their ancestry, right? And that means that we can use that information to potentially do better. And I'm wondering what that better thing is. Is it that, once we know who your parents are, we hold you in that light? Or is it that is the better option to always, and absolutes are never get it, absolutes are never a good thing, but sometimes it makes me wonder if we hold individuals as separate from their lineage, as you are not your parents, you have your own life, you are you. And I see the beauty in that. And I feel like every time we start to attach ourselves to our lineage, it becomes I don't necessarily buy into my history. So it's really, I'm struggling with that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really interesting point, especially given that this is a world, and and this goes for real life too, where many times power is passed through bloodline. And so you have Ezran and Harrow that, like, Ezran inherits the throne because Harrow had the throne. So there is an inherent kind of path that power takes, that it is like embedded in the system that people follow of civilization, and so it's very hard to separate that out when you're looking at others as well.
Yeah. But I also, so on the other hand, so on the first hand, I appreciate being like, I'm not my parents. Don't treat me like that. I'm separate. I'm my own person. But on the other hand, I really love the concept of we're all connected to each other, right? We all have a shared lineage in some way, shape, or form. And that really is something that I buy into, because what it does is it forces me to reconcile our differences and say, how can we work together, rather than, nope, I am an individual and you are separate from me. And so I feel more comfortable creating walls that separate us, right? Whereas if we're connected, I am compelled to take those walls down. And so there's this invitation for lineage for me to, how do I honor that while also honoring, it's this paradox, it's a paradox, right? I want to honor the individual and I want to honor the lineage as well. And I want those two to play well together. And what we're seeing is it's very complicated in this episode.
Oh yeah. And I think that that's what makes relationships like Callum and Harrow so beautiful, because there isn't that blood relation, but there's still every bit of that love and that wanting to carry on that lineage and legacy from one generation to the next.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's for me, if we use the metaphor of like authorship, right? It's I have not held the pen for everybody who came before me, but now I do hold the pen. And so I get to change the direction of the story, right? I get to author my portion of it. And while I need to remember the history that has come before me, otherwise the story won't make sense, right? I want to make sure I'm carrying elements of that, but how do I live in this redemptive model of, and it's in, at the same time, I don't want to always have to redeem everything that was done, right? And it's this really, because that makes me think about like race and reparation and things like that, where when it comes with me being a white person, a white male for that, thinking about the history of my lineage and what white people have done over the history is atrocious. And if I'm like, I'm my own person, I have nothing to do with that, it causes a lot of problems. So I can't just disown that and separate it and say I'm a new person. I have to honor what has been done and what has come before me, but that doesn't mean I have to take part in it, right? It doesn't mean I have to act in a way that continues that story. I can change that story and use my actions to do something different. And at the same time, it's really hard because there are certain things that my parents have done or great grandparents have done where I'm like, I'm not going to include that in my story. That's hard. That's a hard boundary. That's not continuing with me. And so again, it's complicated. It's tough. I've been talking a lot. What are your thoughts? There's a lot going on there.
Yeah. I mean, I think as we related to the episode, we see Rayla sort of take it upon herself to sort of redeem her parents through her own actions and her own sacrifice, which is something that Callum kind of chews her out for, even though, you know, I can totally understand where she's coming from, because, you know, she has internalized this so much that she thinks it's you know, her responsibility to make the sacrifice because her parents didn't, even though they actually did.
Well, and that's where I'm sitting here, like I'm Callum in this situation. I'm like, you have no reason to do anything in this moment. You get to make your own decision, and you do not have to make up for your parents' fault in this mistake, right?
Yeah.
You doing that serves no good purpose other than, like, and that's what he called. He's like, this is pride. This is ego. This is pride. And it's one thing, I think, to honor the lineage when the outcome makes sense. But for me, like, doing it just to do it, or to do it for that, just for that sake, seems like it's missing something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's where, you know, when Callum is able to show her the truth and she's able to get a full picture, and then they can make the decision whether to stay or go, you know, and it's more separated from that sense of responsibility over a parent's failure. You know, I think
the question, though, is, let's assume for just a moment that Rayla's parents were, you know, the cowards she calls them, and they ran away like that Skywing elf, and, you know, Viren was left to just come in, right? And let's say he just wasn't planning to kill it, he was planning to take it all along, right? It's one of those things where I'm sitting here going, like, that probably would have convinced Rayla that she needed to, like, double down on her thoughts, versus this story that freed her from it. And I think my assertion is that, no, you still don't need to double down. But it's interesting how people are so attached to the things that our parents have done, or the things that whatever we are a part of identity wise have done. It's really fascinating.
So I think that's an interesting point. And I mean, hopefully this isn't going too far off the tracks, but if Callum had seen it, because, you know, he looked at this vision himself. If Callum had seen, oh crap, Rayla's parents did actually run away, would he have showed her?
I don't know. Good point. Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, because I feel like it's one of those things where maybe the uncertainty around what happens is better than knowing for sure, if the answer is what you're afraid of.
I would like to think that he would share, but
yeah,
I don't know, because we know how important this is to her. But I don't know. Yeah,
he wouldn't need to explain breaking the pendant, the moon pendant.
That's true. Interesting. Let's talk about Callum for a second. Can we shift from Rayla to Callum? I'm curious. I've been thinking about this for a minute, and thinking about humans and magic, and there's been tons of theories on Reddit and the Dragon Prince community on Facebook and all the things, where, like, who is Callum's mother, right? And or rather, who is Callum's father, sorry. And thinking about, like, is Callum's father an elf? Does that like just defeat the purpose of a human doing magic? And why are we, like, entertaining this? And that's why it wouldn't be nearly as cool if Callum had elf blood. But it raises the question, right, of what is Callum's lineage, and was his dad a mage of some sort, or did he have some sort of magic influence? Who knows? But it's a question that's worth asking there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually haven't thought about that much. Um, yeah, wow. It would be interesting if his father had mage capabilities. I don't know how I would feel if his father were an elf, because I do really like the storyline of him kind of combating his own expectations as well as others' expectations about what his capabilities are.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, I think that sort of retroactively going back and saying, well, his father was an elf, would kind of undo some of that,
I agree.
depending on how they go about it. Um, but yeah, I can't believe I hadn't really thought about that much. It would, yeah,
Well,
I would be surprised if we didn't learn more about it as the show goes on.
oh, I'm almost certain we'll learn more. It's a matter of how and when and what.
Yeah,
I would be shocked if we didn't learn who Callum's father was eventually. Because that's been a question from the beginning. Like episode 1, we're like, okay, we know that this is a different dad. Who was his dad? That's the one of the first questions. But this fact that he is, and let's assume his father is human, the fact that he is acting in such a way that defies his lineage is really interesting to me, right?
for sure.
Where oftentimes we lineage is like seen as something where it is valuable to live into your lineage. Rayla is the opposite of Callum in this respect. Rayla is trying to live into this story of her lineage and trying to live into the honor of what it means to be a moon shadow elf that honors her responsibilities. Whereas Callum is kind of the opposite of, I am a human mage and no other humans have been able to do this before. So I'm kind of pioneering this new thing in order to reshape what humans can do. And I find that to be really interesting too, as a storyline to think about how on both sides of it, I want to again honor what has passed, but also like show that we don't have to live by what has been before us too. And I think
Yeah,
that's what we get from Callum. Thoughts? What are your thoughts there?
yeah, that's interesting because I think it almost brings up this idea of, you know, appropriation almost, where, you
I
know,
wrote that down. Yes.
and we kind of see that in the beginning of the next episode where, you know, he's painting these symbols on his arms, and it, for to me, that kind of gave like a very like cultural kind of vibe. And I
Yeah.
don't want to go too far into that the next episode, but it's an interesting thing where I have full faith that Callum is the type that, in however he approaches learning these skills from other elves, he's going to do it in the most respectful way possible.
Yeah.
But it is like, looking at from the elf's perspective, there might be a certain amount of like trepidation that they feel
Mhm.
around this human that's coming in and saying like, well, I'm going to learn how to fly, which is an ability that's learned by a very select few
Yeah.
skywing elves.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what's so interesting for me is, let's go into the lineage of these skywing elves, right? Like 1 in 10 are born with wings, and then even fewer still have the capacity to do the magic that allows them to transform in a way that allows them to have wings. And
Right.
that to me seems like Ibis was like, this is kind of a big deal. Right.
Right.
And like the fact that there is such pride in that kind of lineage and that skill and that capacity, and the fact that Callum is going to come in and like, hey, teach me, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's I recently took part in an appropriation workshop around spiritual appropriation and how do we avoid spiritual appropriation, right? And I think one of the things that we need to kind of think about, there's three main pillars and there's kind of sub pillars, but one is like education. What is our understanding of the original context of this practice? And Callum, has been given a little bit of information, but he only has this little bit of information before he starts trying it, right? The next one is relationship. Has this been given to us, or is this something we are taking?
Yeah.
And in a way, Callum is taking this information, right? It has not been, right. It hasn't really been freely given to him. And that to me borders on, this is kind of, it's leaning into this appropriation, right? Appropriation of skill, appropriation of magic. And like, that's getting awkward now. And then the next one is, like thinking about power, right? And who is benefiting from it. So when Callum takes this magic, who's benefiting from it? It's like Callum is. Like, it's not benefiting the larger community, it's benefiting Callum. And frankly, it's benefiting, Rayla. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
As a general rule, I'm lifting this up because it seems like this is borderline appropriation. And I'm really glad that you lifted it up, because I think about like the lineage of things being passed down, and when things are okay to practice and do, and then when things are not. And I am going to step aside from that and just talk about this from looking at it from another angle and say, I also don't blame Callum, because Callum is doing things, one, to literally save people. Like, he is doing this not only out of his own personal desire, but he's like going to save another person. But aside from that, I also think about the power dynamic. And I think that's what makes it okay for me, is this one human who no humans have access to magic at all, aside from Callum, without some sort of tool. And if they do, it's dark magic.
Yeah.
And this whole race of elves that have this capacity, maybe or maybe not. And then Callum is able to come in and do this. So I don't know. I really struggle with this as an appropriation question, because it seems like the power imbalance makes it seem like I don't know that I mind Callum having this ability. So that was a complicated series of thought conversations, but yeah.
I don't think there's a right answer around that. Especially since, it also makes me think of, drawing the connection to Avatar. The Avatar obviously has an understood duty to learn all of the elements.
Yep.
But one of the things that I'm most interested in that universe is like the cultures that are tied in with each element, and how does the Avatar navigate that as they go through their journey. And we see Aang and Korra respect very effective journeys. But yeah, and I kind of see a similar thing with Callum here, where he sees it, learning these skills in part because it's something that he's good at and enjoys, but there's also like a very like, he is trying to help save the world, and learning these skills definitely helps in that.
And I am definitely not going to presume that we're going to solve this problem right now, and we're going to solve the problem of appropriation right here, now. But I think it is worth lifting up the question, and I would love to hear from other listeners that have more insight into this concept and thinking about like, how do we feel about this? Would love to hear about that. But let's go. Can we switch tacks again?
Oh yeah.
I want to talk about Zen for a second.
Yes.
This was a really heartfelt moment for me where Ezran and Zim are about to go into the Queen's chamber, and Zim is like, no, thank you, I'm not ready. And, we hear kind of Ezran translating that for us. But I found that to be really interesting in thinking about this separation of lineage also, and thinking about who we are in relationship with versus who we are tied to by blood.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of like adopted children who end up having the opportunity to meet their bio parents. And, Zim thus far has been raised by Callum, Rayla, and Ezran. And from cracking open that egg, like that's been who's been taking care of him. And Zim is at the point where he's going to meet bio mom, and I don't know what that means in terms of what does Zim feel ownership in terms of being bonded to this, or does Zim like, no, I prefer this group of people. And when you extrapolate that to like adopted children, it's really interesting to think about how some adopted children are like, nope, you were just the person who bore me, and I really have no connection to you and no desire to have any connection to that because I don't need that in my life. And then there are some who are like, but what about who I came from and where I came from, and really want that story to be tethered to. And so that was something that came up for me. What are your thoughts on this moment with Zim?
So it's really interesting that that's the perspective you had watching, because what I thought of during this is, when animals and, when any being is born, typically there's they imprint on
Yep.
whatever parental figure is there. In this case, I would believe that it would be Ezran with Zim, because it seems like they have the strongest relationship. However, I will say that it seems to be that dragons have some sort of identity and consciousness even before they hatch. Zim knows his name.
Yep.
So it could be that there's a middle path between both, like this sense of like imprinting and identity and sense of relationship based on that, and this sense of like as you mentioned, biological versus adoptive relationship, and it could be a middle path between those that makes this a very confusing time for him.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, it's pointing to this paradox of it's nature and nurture, right?
Yeah.
And it's not one or the other, it's both. And how do you hold them in conversation? And sometimes nurture has a greater influence on us than does the opposite of what I said. Nature and nurture have different influences, and they need to be balanced. And it's interesting to think about, right? Because this moment with Zim kind of highlights that, of even though we have this long line of people, who we are in relationship with matters a great deal also. So yeah, I find that to be really curious. I'm curious.
Yeah. And one thing I also thought of was in the last episode, I think it was the last episode or the episode before, he sees his father, who's been frozen, and I can only imagine how traumatizing that is. So coming right off of that, like
I
there
don't
might
know.
be a certain hesitation to say, like, what state is my mother going to be in when I see her?
Yeah,
Can I handle this again?
yeah, I'm curious about that, because we also see him and Ezran like playing and like really like, reconnecting in the shadow of Thunder's statue, right? And I'm sitting here going like, that's a tough scene.
Yeah.
Like, this is the site at which Harrow kind of gave in to his hatred and his dark and this dark magic, and this is kind of like what sealed Zim's fate in the same time. And it's like, here we are with these two children of them playing together, and like that was a really complicated scene that was done really well, I thought. But yeah, to me it almost didn't seem like Zim even registered what was going on in that moment. But I don't, who knows, maybe he was distracted a little bit. But yeah. What else, other moments that you want to talk about in this episode?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest one for me is probably Soren and Viren, but I don't know.
We haven't talked about that. We should talk about them.
Yeah.
What about it?
So I think that, this season especially, Soren has a tremendous amount of growth. And as I think it's you and Kelly discussed, it comes from this moment where Viren essentially decides to fracture this relationship with Soren, instead saying, okay, we need Claudia later on, and we don't necessarily need Soren. And so then from that moment on, Soren has kind of been on this trajectory of leaving Viren. And I think that for me, the point of no return and the moment that really like seals this turn is not when he leaves Viren, and not any moment of confrontation with Viren, but it's his moment with Claudia last episode. Because they've been in this together, and obviously their relationships, especially this season, have diverged more because they each have a very different relationship with Viren. I think a lot of it has to do with Claudia's abilities to perform dark magic that like facilitate this connection, and also her usefulness to Viren more on a more darker note. But you know, we see in a few shows, you know, Legend of Korra, you have Tarlok and
Unalak, no,
and Amon. What's
Noatak.
Noatak, thank you so much. Where you have a parental figure that is creating this wedge between the children. One of them leaves, and then the other is like incredibly betrayed by this. This is obviously very different circumstances, but I think it's also similar in the sense that when Soren leaves, that's also a turning point for Claudia, where her only point of support, and I think her main point of support in essentially dealing with Viren's abuse is gone, and so she has to kind of deal with this on her own. And I think she kind of takes that and almost like fully commits to Viren.
I think what I recently read an interview with Justin Richmond and Aaron Eaz about Claudia, and it was essentially saying that, like, Claudia in that last episode, spoiler alert, like has done some dark stuff, and they're like, and it's only going to get worse. And but what makes Claudia complicated is that she is doing this out of love, and
Yeah.
love is her motivation, which is really fascinating because what she has done in that episode is like, whoa. We'll talk more about that next episode. But it's interesting to me because everything that she has been doing thus far has been out of love. It's always out of love. And what I think allows her to continue to stay with Viren is that she believes that Viren is doing this out of love also.
Yeah.
She believes that he genuinely believes in all of the lies that he is telling her and telling the world and telling everybody. And it's really interesting to me because we see the complicated nature of Viren here also when he's talking to Erebos. Because Erebos in, I think, the prior episode was also like, so you're trying to conquer the world, right? And he's like, no, I just want humanity to have the best possible situation. And Erebus is like, so you're going to conquer the world, right? And he's like, yeah, right. So it's almost like he's lying to himself about his desires and goals as well. And I think the fact that he is lying so well is enabling Claudia to buy into this. And the fact that Soren was used, saw what was going on and saw this manipulation because he got to personally experience the manipulation. That's what enabled him to go and step away.
Yeah. And you can't, I'm sure it's heartbreaking for him to see what's happening with Claudia because this kind of manipulation is not something that can really be broken from the outside. And you can't brute force someone's like realization that they are being manipulated. Because typically what's going to happen is like if you try to convince someone, they're gonna delve deeper into the manipulation, because if the person doing the manipulation and like Viren is good at what they do, it's quicksand.
But again, the benefit of the doubt here is I am constantly doubting Viren because I'm sitting here going like, no, this is intentional. No, this is intentional. But then that moment with Erebos really made me question that, where he's like, no, this is for the good of mankind, where he's genuinely bought into this complete lie that he's telling himself, but he's bought into it. Right? He believes that what he is doing is going to benefit the world and benefit humanity. And we see this gradual slippage from all of these memories that we've been watching over the past couple of seasons, where he's going back to the Magma Titan, going back to Sarai, which that's complicated. But like going back to all of these moments where we see it getting progressively worse. And we see him continue to buy into it from all of these things. And the problem for me is, how do we have conversations with people who genuinely believe that what they're doing is the right thing to do when it is so clearly not? The problem is they believe it. They are so bought into it. And this is the same question that whoever I might say that is, are having about us, right? And that makes it really difficult to have these conversations. How do you? And I think that's the underlying question: is how do you have a conversation, a generous assumption conversation of, hey, I believe that you believe what you're saying. And I think we need to talk about the methods that we're utilizing and why that's not going to work. Because this is what's coming down to why it's really difficult for Democrats and Republicans to have conversations. It's coming down to why, all of these various dichotomies that exist, especially in the United States, they exist worldwide, but especially in the United States right now. That's the fundamental question. And I wish I had a good answer.
Yeah. And I think that's what made Harrow and Viren's relationship so interesting. Because they were kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum in that regard in many ways. But they had such a close relationship that, especially towards the end, was starting to somewhat show its cracks.
Well, I think that's what's interesting is they disagreed over small things at first, and eventually the divide grew and grew and grew to the point where like Harrow was like, dark magic is the worst.
Yeah.
Because he started to see what it was doing. Whereas Viren was like, this is what has enabled us to get this far in the first place.
Exactly.
So it's all about the story we tell ourselves about the lineage that we have received, right? That's what I'm coming down to is how do we tell the story in a way that helps us help each other, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We've been going. We have had talked several things. Are there other things we need to make sure we hit on before we transition?
Let's see. Well, I mean, it's not really featured as much at the forefront of this episode, but you also have Ezran trying to move forward from Harrow's legacy. You know, we talked a little bit about how Harrow kind of gave in to his hate, and kind of set the stage for a lot of the tension we have now, especially centered around Zim, because it's his decisions that led to the egg being taken, and Zim's parents being sort of taken out of commission. And Ezran is trying to come to terms with that, and move forward in a way that is, best for everyone.
Yeah, and we see him going through that basically this whole season, right? As he steps onto the throne, as he grapples with, Kasif, and then as he decides to abdicate and let Viren take over. It's a series of how do I be different and live into my values and stop the cycle, so to speak. And then when he chooses to get here, he's really living into how do I protect, right? That's like his value is like, this is something we need to protect, right? And we just see him continually choosing his values over his lineage, right? And I think that that's something that's really admirable. And I think that there are some times where it's admirable to choose lineage over value, right? And I'm really curious about, again, just how complicated it is to have a lineage that is counter to our values, and then how do we grapple with it?
Right. And I'm sure a really difficult point for him, because he's still a child, is that like in learning these things about Harrow is no longer there to both counsel him and also to sort of discuss these decisions and learn more about what was going on. He can only sort of match these decisions up with the internalized object he has of Harrow in his head based on when he last knew him before he passed away. And that is incredibly difficult to do, because this internalized object is based on all your projections of this person.
Exactly.
And not necessarily the objective view of the person themselves.
Well, and that's the same thing with Rayla's story, right? All she had was the story people were telling about her parents, not the actual story. And so again, I feel like when is it not a good option to be generous with our stories? I don't know. I'm thinking more and more that that's kind of the takeaway here is how do we be generous with the stories if they're not shaping us in a way that we would like.
Right.
All right. I am going to give us a short break. We're going to bring on the music and let them tickle our listeners' ears for a second, and then we'll come on back for our couple final of segments. All right, here we go. All right, welcome back. Thanks for enjoying that little musical interlude. We are about to dive into our final couple of segments, and I'm excited because we've had polls on our Lynn's MVPs and our Patreon and our Facebook group on who has won for our nominations. And so far, I am 0-2 to the patrons, which is somewhat frustrating. We'll see if that continues after this. But what we have is Lynn's MVP. So Rahul is going to nominate someone, a character from this episode, for who he thinks the Lynn's MVP is. And remember everybody, our lens for this episode is lineage. And I'm interested to see where you take this, Rahul. Who are you nominating for the Lynn's MVP around lineage?
I picked Soren because I think throughout this season, as we mentioned, and especially this episode, he has had to come to terms with his relationship with Viren. And as you mentioned in your episode with Jesse, the voice actor for Soren, his relationship with Viren is really based around his desire for Viren to love and accept him.
Yeah.
And he has realized that he can't make that happen. And if it's not like in Viren's nature to do so, it's really not going to happen. And as we see at the end of this episode, he goes as far as to say that Viren is evil and needs to be stopped. He is the determining factor. Yeah, he's the determining factor in the group to stay and fight, which I think is incredibly important and noteworthy because, again, this is his father. And to be able to sort of look back and reflect on how Viren has manipulated him to make decisions outside of his own value system and look forward and see like he's on a trajectory now that like if we run, this is not going to stop.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate Soren's growth to this point to be able to acknowledge where Viren is at, and the nature of their relationship as father and son.
And that's something that we didn't really talk about when it comes to lineage that I find really important is oftentimes we turn to lineage when we are feeling like we don't belong anywhere. Oftentimes that we believe that lineage is the place where we belong because of that blood tie. And I think that's what makes leaving Viren so hard is like, no, this is where I belong. This is my people, right? This is my family. This is like who I am tied to in a very literal way. And that belonging was abused. Right. And that's what makes it all the more tragic when lineage becomes complicated. Right.
Yeah. And
right.
Yeah. And even when he leaves Claudia as well, Claudia is someone who loves him.
Yes.
And, goes to extreme measures to save him and protect him. And so, it's incredibly hard to reconcile that.
Yeah. So if I were to put that into a headline for you, I'm hearing that Soren is your nomination because he is reconciling the difficulty of his lineage with his values to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of summing it up.
Okay. All right. So we've heard Rahul's nomination. Again, I am 0-3 and I'm not salty at all, or 0-2 and I'm not salty at all. That was not a Freudian slip. I am hoping to win after this episode's poll, but I'm going to nominate Rayla. And Rayla is all kinds of tied up in her lineage this episode, and really attached to the story of her parents. And not just the story of her parents, but also the culture of Moonshadow elves. And I think that's part of her lineage too. And I think that the story that her culture has weaved for her and raised her in to view her parents a certain way, the attachment to her parents because they're her parents. And it seems like she is really gripping both of these things really hard, both of these attachments to culture and to parent. And she's trying to make them work, and she feels like this constant need to defend and make them to redeem her parents, right, in the eyes of her community. And on the other hand, we see her choosing her values, and for a very similar way to you in nominating Soren, I feel like she is reconciling how her values need to live into this conversation. And I think what makes it really complicated is that this is the first time she's been so proximate that we know of to the location where her parents made this happen. And right. So I think that's why she's so all up in her feelings right now and all up in this story, is because this is the place where it happened. Like, talk about the lineage of like visiting. It reminds me of like visiting, like taking pilgrimages to visit the places that our ancestors have visited, and really kind of leaning into like the spirituality of being connected to the same place in the same location that our ancestors have been a part of. And yeah, I think that her coming here was difficult, and that was something that was not necessarily said aloud. Like, just being in this place is hard for her.
Oh yeah.
Until Callum shares the real story, right, of what happened. So yeah, I think that's the reason, is because she's all up in her feelings about this. And it's because if I were to be frank, I think Soren is on the other side of grappling with this, and she's still in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And maybe not on the other side, but certainly over, like, he's been going uphill and has now like plateaued / about to go downhill in terms of understanding where he is, whereas Rayla's like at the peak in this episode. So I'm just gonna, slightly elevate her above Soren for that reason. So I'm inviting everyone to vote either in our Facebook group. If you haven't joined us, feel free. It's open to everybody. And then also on Patreon, if you're a patron, to vote there. We'd love to see the poll and your response. So those are our two. Feel free to vote for either Soren or Rayla, or if you feel really gutsy, you can nominate someone yourself in the poll, and we'll see how that goes. But I digress. You can also find us at Bending Not Breaking. That's how you find us, or BNB_pod for Patreon. Gratitude. It's time for gratitude. My favorite. All right, Rahul, who are you grateful for?
I'm grateful for Ezran, both for some of the subtextual elements we talked about, and him sort of trying to move forward given what he knows about Harrow's legacy, but also more directly in the episode, he shows very little hesitation in helping Soren, who is someone that, like, as obviously they feel betrayed by based on his previous actions. And you see with Callum and Rayla, there's a hesitance to help him. And then when they see him, Ezran says something to the effect of just like, stop talking, help him. He can't breathe. And then Callum's like, okay, yeah, right, you're right. And then helps him. And then they give Soren the chance to explain himself. And I just find that so amazing that Ezran just has this presence of mind to say, like, all right, like, just, don't question it, help him.
Yeah, priorities first, people. Let's keep them alive. Yeah, and it's interesting. I love that kind of people first mentality that we get from Ezra, and not just people first, but like life first.
Yeah,
Is Ezra's kind of mentality of what is most sacred, right? And I really appreciate that from Ezra, because we learn a lot from Ezra over the course of this show about the sanctity of life, and I really appreciate that from him. So yeah,
absolutely.
I'm grateful for that as well. I am going to pick Amaya, and this is not necessarily for something she did consciously, but rather something she does just by being herself and by living into her values over time. We see her slowly build a bond with Janai over the course of this season, being in captivity. But also this whole time she was living by her values, right? She stood up to Janai and said, nope, I'm going to blow this up so you can't get across. And then, nope, I'm going to tell you everything that's wrong with Viren, and I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to hold your hand down, even though it burns me. And then she's just this series of her living into her values and choosing herself and really nurturing that integrity that's within her, to the point where, because of her actions, the entire Sunfire Elf army is at Dragonspire, ready to defend it. And I think that it's because of Amaya that all of that was able to happen. And I'm really grateful that, she found, she's able to kind of lead just by being herself. And I think that's why people follow her, and why she probably ranked up really high. And that's why she is who she is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And again, I'm sure everybody's looked this up, but I also love this moment that she has with Janai in sign language, that she's like, she doesn't know it yet, but she thinks I'm pretty cute also. So anyway, I digress, but I like Amaya. I really found her in this episode, even though it's very minimal, to be a guiding light, so to speak.
Yeah.
Wow. A lot happened in this episode.
Yeah.
I think I say that a lot, but a lot did happen. Oh, man. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a real pleasure and a treat to have this
Thank you for having me.
For everybody who's listening, we are on all the platforms, social media wise. We are Bending Not Breaking, or BNB_pod, Twitter, Facebook. We'll tweet at you if you tweeted us. Same thing on Instagram generally. We'll handle that. And then we're on Facebook pretty often. If you join us on Patreon, you can join us for live episodes every month, which are super fun. We will be continuing, spoiler alert for our patrons, continuing with book 2 of Avatar and the Last Airbender, starting with episode 1 this month of season 2. So very exciting. And Rahul, how would you want people to find you if you so want that to happen? Or do you want that kind of attention? What's your thought?
I mean, if people would like to find me, I'm mainly active on Instagram, I think. So you can find me at R.A. Doraiswamy. That's RADORAISWAMY on Instagram. Yeah, that would pretty much be it.
Nice. Well, great. Well, we can find you. We have a really great episode that you all got to enjoy with Rahul. So even if you don't find him on Instagram, you can always just re-listen to this episode again and again and again. But that is everything. But I've asked Maggie and Kelly what their kind of favorite perk was on Patreon. I'm curious if you have one that has kind of stuck out to you as well.
It would definitely be consistent with them and in being the live episodes. Those are a ton of fun. Definitely something to look forward to each month. And I'm really excited to get into book 2.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been a wonderful episode with Rahul. Thank you so much for joining us. And this has been Bending Not Breaking. And until next time, be well and do good.